Two amphibious warships just crossed into open water, and nobody in Washington has explained why. The USS Boxer and the USS Portland slid into the Indian Ocean this week, carrying a full Marine Expeditionary Unit, more than 2,000 Marines with the equipment to fight, to land, to hold ground if given the order. Their movement was confirmed not by a press conference, but by a single military post, 3 lines long, time-stamped, unadorned, the kind of announcement that tells you everything and nothing at once. Add that to what was already sitting in the region, and the count becomes impossible to ignore. 24 warships, 2 aircraft carriers, the Abraham Lincoln and the George H.W. Bush, riding at the center of a formation of 15 destroyers. A second amphibious ready group joining a first that has been parked off the coast since early May. This is not a peacetime posture. This is not what a resolved war is supposed to look like. Months after the guns were meant to have gone quiet. Understand what that stretch of water is actually worth before any of the rest of this makes sense. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 24 miles wide at its narrowest point, and through that narrow gap moves close to a fifth of the entire world's oil supply. Tanker after tanker, threading a channel so tight that a single mine, a single blocked hull, a single miscalculated warning shot can send insurance premiums and pump prices climbing on the other side of the planet within hours. That is the stage this entire story is playing out on. Not an abstract diplomatic dispute in a faraway capital, but the single most valuable choke point in global trade, currently patrolled by warships from at least half a dozen nations, all watching each other, all waiting to see who moves first. And yet somewhere in Doha, in a hotel conference room far from any of those ships, 2 American envoys sat across from a Qatari emir this week and used the word progress. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner met with Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. And by every official account, the conversation was calm, cooperative, forward-moving. Technical talks continuing. Good conversations with regional leaders. The vocabulary of diplomacy laid gently over the top of a naval buildup large enough to fight a second war on its own. Somewhere between those 2 rooms, the ships and the negotiating table, is the truth about where this actually stands tonight. And that gap between the language of peace and the machinery of war sitting a few hundred miles offshore is exactly where this story lives. Because here is what almost nobody said out loud when it happened. A memorandum of understanding was signed on June the 17th. 14 points, carefully worded, brokered with Pakistani mediation, meant to close out a war that started on February the 28th and had already cost close to 3,400 lives inside Iran alone, more than 2,000 in Lebanon, dozens across the Gulf states, and dozens more among American service members who never came home. Everyone called the memorandum a turning point. Every network ran the same relieved headline. And in the 3 weeks since, that relief has started to sound less like resolution and more like a held breath, waiting to see if the next news cycle breaks the whole arrangement apart before the ink even dries. Remember what that war actually did before anyone signed anything. Flights across the entire Middle East ground to a near complete stop. Dubai's international airport, one of the busiest on the planet, took a drone strike on the second day of the conflict and reopened only in limited capacity days later. Even a NATO ally balked. Spain refused to let the United States use its air bases, and the American president threatened to cut trade with Madrid over it, a rupture between allies that never fully closed. And when Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening days of the war, the country did not descend into chaos the way many analysts predicted. It moved fast, installing a new leader within days, proof to hardliners at home that the regime could absorb a decapitation strike and still stand upright. That is the war everyone is pretending is finished. It is not finished. It has simply changed shape because it very nearly already has. Sit with that for a moment, because what comes next moves fast and none of it slows down to explain itself. First, there was Doha, calm and procedural, technical teams working through implementation language behind closed doors. Then within days, Iran's chief negotiator sat down for a lengthy interview on state broadcaster IRIB and said something that should have stopped every newsroom mid-broadcast. He called the war a divine blessing. Not a catastrophe his country survived. A gift handed down, worth celebrating. He said negotiations themselves were finished, that only implementation of the memorandum remained, and then he drew a line that had nothing to do with the ceasefire. Everyone thought they had already locked in. Lebanon, he said, is Iran's first priority now, one of its actual red lines. And ending the fighting there is a precondition for anything else moving forward at all. A brand new condition, introduced weeks after the deal was supposedly closed, attached to a country most of the ceasefire coverage had already stopped mentioning by name. Then, within the same 48 hours, the American president posted a warning on his own platform that read less like diplomacy and more like a countdown clock. If Iran could not be reasonable, he wrote, the United States would finish what it started, and the Islamic Republic would cease to exist. Read that sentence again. Not a policy statement filtered through a briefing room. Not a warning softened by aides before it reached the public. A public threat of national annihilation. Posted the same week. American envoys were praising the pace of technical talks in a Doha hotel less than a day's flight away. Then Tehran answered, and not through official channels either. Iran's foreign minister posted directly, accusing the American president of failing to control Israel, describing Washington's closest regional ally as a pet that needed muzzling, and warning that any threat against Iran's people or its leadership would receive what he called an immediate and powerful response. Undiplomatic language, deliberately so, chosen for an audience at home, watching every public word for the small sign of weakness after a war their government insists it did not lose. And then, almost as if on cue, Israel's defense minister gave the interview that turned a war of words into something closer to a war of intentions. He said the man now serving as Iran's supreme leader, the son who inherited the position after his predecessor, was killed during the February strikes on the very body meant to choose his successor, was, in his own words, marked for death. Remember who that successor actually is. He was widely described at the time of his appointment as more hawkish, more repressive than the father he replaced, installed despite the American president publicly calling the choice unacceptable before it even happened. A leader Washington objected to from day one is now, months later, the specific individual an Israeli cabinet minister has just marked by name 4 separate escalations, 4 separate statements, 4 days. None of them walked back afterward. None of them explained by the people who made them. So which version of this is real? The version where technical teams sit calmly in a Doha conference room, discussing implementation timelines, or the version where a nation is told on social media it will cease to exist, where a sitting head of state is described as marked for death, where a red line nobody mentioned in June suddenly becomes the entire ballgame by the second week of July. Both versions are happening at once in the same week, involving the same people, and that contradiction is not a communications failure on anyone's part. It is the actual story underneath the story. So answer the question directly, because someone has to. If negotiations are truly finished, as Tehran's own negotiator claimed on state television, then what exactly are Witkoff and Kushner still doing in that Doha hotel? And why does Tehran keep sending people to sit across from them? If Lebanon was never mentioned as a red line when the 14 points were signed on June the 17th, then explain where this new condition came from and who inside the Iranian government decided this was the week to introduce it. If the American president genuinely believes Iran's leadership deserves to be told, in public, that their country will cease to exist, then explain why his own envoys are still describing the pace of technical talks as good progress in the very same week. Somebody in this story is not telling the truth about what they actually want, and it may not be only one side. Now turn to the water itself, because underneath the speeches sits a fight over something far more specific and far more revealing about who actually believes they won this war. Who controls the Strait of Hormuz? Iran's negotiator was explicit about this too. As a gesture of goodwill, Tehran agreed to waive transit fees for 60 days, so vessels trapped during the conflict could finally leave the region. A gesture with an expiration date quietly built into the fine print of a ceasefire. Almost nobody read past the headline announcing it, because those fees were never a footnote to begin with. Back in March, at the height of the fighting, Iran's Revolutionary Guard actually constructed a physical checkpoint inside the strait, a toll booth for the single most contested waterway on the planet. The American president promised the passage would be permanently toll-free. His vice president promised the same thing for the long term in nearly identical language. And within weeks of that promise, Iran's own foreign ministry spokesman clarified, almost casually, that ships would not technically pay tolls. They would instead pay something called a service fee for navigation assistance. Same payment, moving the same direction, into the same accounts. A different word painted over the exact demand that helped start the standoff in the first place. Meanwhile, the actual machinery keeping that water passable is barely American at all anymore. Britain and France have taken the lead on demining operations, deploying autonomous underwater drones, counter-drone systems, Typhoon fighter jets, and the warship HMS Dragon, and opening an entirely new route off the coast of Oman so commercial vessels can avoid hugging the Iranian shoreline. India has run its own parallel operation, deploying more than 5 frontline destroyers and frigates to escort upward of 20 Indian-flagged cargo ships safely west of the strait. The United States, by contrast, has stayed vague about its own contribution, a mix, officials say, of drone boats, helicopters, and warships, without ever specifying which vessels or how many. The nation that fought the war is, on this particular front, letting its allies do the visible, dangerous, unglamorous work of clearing the mines it helped provoke. This is not the first time an American president has tried to force this exact strait back open by putting ships in front of it. Back in the late 1980s, during what history remembers as the Tanker War, American warships physically escorted reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through these same waters, convoy by convoy, in an operation that became the largest naval escort mission since the Second World War. Even then, the ratio was telling: 2 merchant ships surrounded by 5 American Navy and Coast Guard vessels on the very first run. This spring, the current administration tried its own version, an operation openly named Project Freedom, promising guided missile destroyers and land and sea-based aircraft to guide merchant traffic through the strait. Within hours of that operation going live, Iran's Navy announced it had prevented American ships from entering the strait at all, and both sides spent the following days trading fire and accusations. War risk insurance on tankers moving through these waters had already climbed from a fraction of a percent of a ship's value to nearly 0.5% in the days before the war even began. $250,000 in added cost for a single large tanker, just for the privilege of the crossing. None of that risk has disappeared. It has only gone quiet. Now here is where the ships from the opening actually start to make sense. Because military hardware only tells you something once you understand exactly what each piece is built to do, and why it was sent now rather than months ago. The USS Boxer is an amphibious assault ship, functionally a smaller aircraft carrier purpose, built to launch helicopters and vertical takeoff jets directly onto a beachhead under fire. It does not patrol quietly. It invades the instant it is ordered to. The USS Portland is an amphibious transport dock, essentially a floating garage and barracks combined into a single hull, built to carry landing craft, armored vehicles, and hundreds of Marines from open ocean to hostile shore in one coordinated wave. Together, riding alongside the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, those 2 ships form a self-contained assault package, a complete land invasion force that does not require a friendly airport, a host nation's permission, or advance warning to put boots on contested ground. And they are not sailing alone. The USS Comstock, another transport dock, has been quietly stationed in the region since early May, without the same headlines the Boxer Group is now generating. The Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group, carrying the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, is currently operating in the Arabian Sea, a second fully separate assault force sitting within striking distance of the same coastline. That means, as of this week, the United States has not one but two complete amphibious invasion packages positioned near Iran, layered on top of 2 aircraft carriers and 15 destroyers already in theater. Analysts tracking the fleet in real time are openly calling this the largest American naval buildup in the region, since the war technically ended in a signed ceasefire. Compare that to what the same waters looked like at the peak of the actual fighting back in April, when the Navy had roughly a dozen destroyers total in the Middle East, and the real shape of what is happening becomes impossible to miss. This is not a quiet drawdown after a hard-won victory. This is a second, quieter buildup, arriving exactly as the diplomatic language turns strained, exactly as new red lines get drawn, exactly as threats of annihilation start appearing on social media instead of in briefing rooms. A single supercarrier like the Abraham Lincoln or the George H.W. Bush carries roughly 90 aircraft on its deck. Fighter jets, early warning planes, refuelers, enough combined firepower to contest an entire nation's airspace without a single additional ship in support. Multiply that by 2. Add 15 destroyers, each carrying dozens of vertical launch missile cells. Add 2 complete marine assault packages capable of putting infantry ashore within hours of an order. And what sits off the Iranian coast tonight is no longer a deterrent posture in any traditional sense. It is an option, fully assembled, fully fueled, waiting only for a decision that has not yet been made public in either capital. And it is not happening in a vacuum. This week, under continued and increasingly public pressure from the American president, European leaders were reported closing ranks, coordinating their own positions with one another, rather than negotiating individually with Washington. A quiet but unmistakable sign that even America's closest allies are beginning to hedge against whatever comes next. Even domestically, the cracks are showing. The Vice President and the Secretary of State have reportedly begun taking noticeably different approaches to Iran policy in recent public appearances, 2 men widely understood to be eyeing the same future ambitions, each calculating that the way this crisis ultimately resolves could define which of them their own party trusts with the next chapter. And underneath all of it, the region's own maritime traffic tells a story that neither government has fully addressed. Ship insurers, shipping conglomerates, and freight forwarders have spent months quietly rerouting entire fleets around both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea rather than trust either ceasefire to hold, a slow bleed of confidence that no press release has managed to reverse. That is the real scoreboard here. Not the speeches, not the social media posts, but whether the people who move the world's oil and cargo actually believe this is over. Right now, by every visible measure, they do not. So here is where all of it lands. Because a story built entirely on rising tension eventually has to resolve somewhere, even when the resolution itself is not comfortable to sit with. There is a theory forming among people who watch this conflict for a living, and it fits nearly everything you just heard beat for beat. Start with the timing itself, because timing is rarely accidental in a story this carefully staged on both sides. The Ghalibaf interview aired only after the Doha meeting had already concluded, not before it, which means Tehran waited to see what the Americans would say in private before deciding how loud to be in public. Trump's annihilation post followed within a day, which means Washington chose to answer a domestic Iranian broadcast with a domestic American one, each government performing for its own audience while technically responding to the other. Even Araghchi's line about muzzling pets was aimed less at Washington than at Israel. A warning shot fired through an American intermediary because a direct one was not available. Every escalation this week had 2 destinations, the actual recipient and the domestic audience watching, to see if their side blinked. Iran, this theory holds, is speaking to 2 audiences at once. Publicly defiant, invoking divine blessing, drawing new red lines, warning of an immediate and powerful response. Privately, still sending senior negotiators to Doha, still working line by line through the 14 points of the memorandum, still technically choosing implementation over open confrontation whenever the cameras are off. Washington may be running the mirror image of the same play, threatening annihilation in public for an audience of allies and hardliners who fear looking weak after a war that was framed at home as an outright victory, while quietly keeping envoys at the table, because nobody sitting in that Doha conference room actually wants a second war to open on their watch. Two performances, running at the same time, aimed at two entirely different rooms, and the rest of the world watching the warships move, and the insults fly without ever being told, officially, which performance is the real one, and which is simply theater for the cameras. There is a darker possibility, too. One the two audiences theory does not fully explain away. Performances have a way of becoming real the moment one side stops treating them as performance. A defense minister does not casually name a sitting head of state as marked for death, expecting no response. A president does not threaten a nation's existence in writing expecting it to be read as posture rather than intent. Every actor in this story may believe they are the only ones still play acting while everyone else has started to mean it. And that particular kind of mutual miscalculation is exactly how ceasefires that looked solid on paper have collapsed before, in this region and others, without a single person involved ever deciding on purpose to break them. Here's what actually happened this week. Stacked fast, no elaboration, in the order it landed. A second marine assault force crossed into the Indian Ocean. Iran's chief negotiator declared a new red line over Lebanon that never appeared anywhere in the original June agreement. The American president threatened an entire nation's existence in a public social media post. Iran's foreign minister threatened an immediate and powerful response of his own within hours. Israel's defense minister said Iran's new supreme leader is marked for death. European leaders began closing ranks against Washington's mounting pressure. Global shipping companies kept quietly routing their fleets around the region rather than trust the paperwork. And through every single one of those headlines, without exception, the technical talks in Doha never once stopped. None of that speculation changes what viewers 1,000 miles from either coastline actually feel first, which is the price at the pump and the cost of everything that arrives by container ship. Every one of the 7 headlines above touches the same 24-mile channel that a fifth of the planet's oil has to pass through to reach a market. That is why a naval buildup off a coast most people could not find on a map still matters to a grocery bill on the other side of the world, and why 4 days of statements nobody has walked back are being watched as closely in shipping offices and refinery boardrooms as they are in any government situation room. 2 paths sit in front of this story tonight, and only one of them survives the next few weeks. In the first, the theory holds. The public threats stay public. The private talks stay private. The 14 points get implemented one grinding clause at a time. And in 6 months, this entire week reads as noise, a loud but ultimately empty stretch of posturing that both governments needed their own people to see. In the second path, someone miscalculates. A ship gets too close to a destroyer that has orders nobody outside a briefing room has seen. A red line drawn for a domestic television audience gets treated as real by the country it was aimed at. A threat meant to look tough for cameras gets answered as if it were a declaration. And the machinery already sitting in these waters, the carriers, the destroyers, the 2 separate marine assault forces now parked off the same coastline, stops being posture and starts being an order. So does the ceasefire actually hold? Or does one more headline this week finally break it for good? Does implementation of a 14-point memorandum survive 4 separate threats of annihilation traded across 96 hours? Or was this always the moment everyone quietly expected, the point where the paperwork and the posturing simply stopped being able to coexist in the same news cycle? 2 warships just crossed into open water, carrying enough Marines to hold a beach if it comes to that. And somewhere tonight, in Washington, in Tehran, in a hotel conference room in Doha, where the lights are probably still on, someone already knows exactly which version of this story is about to become the only one that matters. And they are choosing deliberately not to say it out loud yet.